smoke drifted through the hallway long before I stepped out of my room. It curled under my door like a warning, a thin gray thread sliding into my lungs before I even knew it was there. My chest tightened instantly. That sharp, familiar burn spread across my ribs, the one that always told me I had only minutes before the coughing began. I pressed a hand to the doorframe to steady myself, swallowing against the rasp building in my throat. I could already hear Claire's laughter downstairs, light, careless, the sound of someone living in a world where breathing was effortless. Matt was in the kitchen, leaning against the counter like it was his throne, a cigarette glowing between his fingers. Smoke rolled off him in warm, arrogant waves. He didn't even glance at me at first, even as I tried to suck in air that my lungs refused to take. My vision pulsed at the edges. I knew I only had seconds to speak before my voice was swallowed by coughing. "Matt, could you please not smoke inside today?" I managed my voice thin. "My lungs. I'm having trouble." He turned slowly like I'd interrupted something important. His eyes narrowed, scanning me the way someone inspects a stain they wish they could scrub off. Claire leaned against the fridge, arms crossed, smirk playing on her lips. "You don't get to tell me what to do in my house," Matt said softly, dangerously. I opened my mouth to apologize, but the apology never made it out. A burst of movement, fast, hot, brutal, cracked across my face. My head snapped sideways. Pain flooded my cheekbone in a white-hot wave. For a moment I didn't know where the floor was, where my feet were, where the air had gone. Claire didn't gasp. She didn't step forward. She didn't even blink. She smirked wider. My knees buckled and my lungs seized. I clawed for breath as the room blurred, my ears ringing. Somewhere in the distance I thought I heard a door slam, or maybe sirens. Or maybe that was just my heartbeat, wild and panicked. I pressed a shaking hand to my cheek and felt the warmth spreading beneath my skin, the bruise already forming. That slap didn't just split my lip. It cracked open something I didn't know I still had left, my breaking point. When I finally managed to inhale, the air felt broken inside me. Each breath scraped like sand. The kitchen lights shimmered in and out like the room was too bright or too far away. Claire stepped closer, tilting her head the way you might study a painting you didn't quite understand. "You always were dramatic," she murmured. Matt blew out another cloud of smoke. It drifted lazily toward my face. "Learn your place," he said. After a moment, I don't remember standing up, but I found myself gripping the back of a chair, dizzy, fighting not to collapse again. I heard the faint chirp of a police radio from outside. Someone in the neighborhood must have heard the shouting. Claire's eyebrows lifted in mild annoyance. "You'd better tell them nothing happened," she said. "Don't make things worse for yourself." My cheek throbbed with every heartbeat. My lungs worked like broken machinery. I remember thinking, if I stay here, they will kill me without ever raising their voices again. 2 officers knocked a moment later, stepping into a kitchen full of smoke and tension. Claire greeted them with practiced innocence, her tone sweet and polished. She placed a hand gently against my back and said, "She just gets overwhelmed." She didn't mean to alarm anyone. I could barely speak. I tried to explain the slap, the smoke, the fear tightening around my lungs like rope, but my voice cracked, and the cough hit me hard, doubling me over. The officers exchanged concerned looks, but saw no visible injury, no immediate threat they could act on. They asked a few questions. Claire answered for me every time. Eventually they sighed, wrote a brief note, issued a vague warning about keeping the peace, and left. The door closed behind them. Silence slithered into the room like a final insult, and then Claire laughed softly under her breath. By the time I slipped back to my room, my legs trembled with every step. I shut the door and leaned against it, letting a cough tear through my chest, loud, violent, full of a wet rattle that scared even me. My cheek was swollen now, glowing with heat. When I touched, the skin pain flared all the way into my jaw. I sank onto the bed, staring at the peeling corner of paint near the window. The air in my room tasted stale, tinged with smoke that had seeped into the vents days or weeks ago. I tugged my blanket around my shoulders, shivering. I tried to breathe deeply, but the inhale dissolved into a cough that sent sparks through my lungs. I couldn't stop replaying the moment the cigarette smoke drifting toward me, the slap the way Claire's smile curled in satisfaction. I searched my mind for excuses, explanations, anything that could make what happened feel less monstrous. But there was none. What happened was simple. My sister watched her husband hit me, and she enjoyed it. Morning came with no apology, no concern. Just Claire standing in my doorway holding a sheet of paper like it was a court summons. Here, she said, "New house rules." Her voice was flat, as if last night had been nothing more than a mild inconvenience. I blinked at her, still sitting on my bed, holding my aching cheek. "You can't keep disrupting the flow of the household," she said. "We all need to coexist peacefully. That means you follow the rules." I forced myself upright, feeling dizziness spin around me. "What rules?" I asked quietly. Claire stepped inside and handed me the paper. No cooking after 7, no opening windows, no adjusting the thermostat, no using the main bathroom, no guests, no late night walking around. Daily contribution fee, $350. I stared at the list, each item tightening around me like a chain. "I can't afford this," I whispered. "You'll have to figure it out," Claire said with a shrug. "We're not running a charity." My throat tightened as I tried to breathe. The room felt colder, or maybe that was just fear settling into my bones. Later that morning, I walked downstairs to heat tea for my lungs. The house was quiet in the wrong way, heavy, expectant. When I opened the cabinet, I found my inhaler shoved to the back shelf behind a stack of heavy pans. I knew I hadn't put it there. Matt walked in as I struggled to reach it. "You're moving things around again," he said lazily. "Try not to lose your stuff." He lit another cigarette. The smoke rose between us like a wall. I backed out of the kitchen without speaking. My lungs burned for the rest of the day. In the afternoon, I stepped outside to throw away a small bag of trash, a chore Claire assigned me, despite knowing the cold air triggered my symptoms. The sunlight felt too bright, the ground too far, my breath too fragile. And then I saw Marjorie, the neighbor, tending to her yard. She looked up sharply when she spotted me. Her gaze went straight to the fading bruise on my cheek. "Dear, are you all right?" she asked quietly. I startled, shaking my head automatically. "I'm fine. Just adjusting." She looked unconvinced. Her eyes held something like concern and something like recognition. "I hear things," she said softly. "Walls are thin around here." A shiver crawled up my spine. She lowered her voice. "If something feels wrong, it probably is." I nodded once, unable to speak. She didn't push further. She just offered a small, knowing smile and went back to pruning her flowers. Inside the house, silence pressed in again. I climbed the stairs slowly, feeling the weight of the air shift with every step. My breathing grew uneven. The hallway felt colder than the rest of the house. The vent hummed softly, blowing air tinged with that faint bitter smell, smoke, and something chemical I couldn't name. I stood in front of my bedroom door, hand trembling on the knob. This house wasn't shelter. It wasn't a home. It was becoming something else entirely, something that fed on my weakness, something that grew stronger every time I coughed or cried. I closed my eyes, inhaled as deeply as my lungs allowed, and stepped inside. Nothing would ever be the same after last night. I think that was the moment I stopped hoping things would get better, and started realizing I had to find a way out. The morning after the slap felt heavier than my lungs had ever been. I woke with a pounding in my cheekbone and a wheeze deep in my chest, the kind that meant the day would be a battle from the first breath. My room was dim, pale sunlight filtering through a thin curtain Claire had insisted on, because heavy drapes collect dust, and you already cough enough. The air smelled faintly of last night's smoke, as if the walls themselves had absorbed it. I sat up, slowly wincing at the pull of bruised muscles. For a moment I allowed myself to imagine the day would begin gently, that maybe Claire would knock softly, apologize for Matt's behavior, offer a warm breakfast, and pretend she still cared about me. That fantasy lasted only until the real knock came, sharp, impatient, clipped. Claire didn't wait for me to answer. She pushed the door open with her elbow, eyes narrowed, expression stiff. You're awake. Good, she said. We need to get some things straight. She held out a sheet of paper. I blinked at it, still disoriented. It trembled in her hand, not from nerves but from annoyance, as though my slower breathing inconvenienced her. What is this? I asked. Household responsibilities, she said. Rules, expectations. My heart thudded. I hadn't even left the bed and already my chest felt tight. I took the paper. Her voice dropped lower. And Anna, don't bring up last night again. Matt was stressed. You provoked him. Let's move on. She walked away before I could form a reply. I stared at the list. No using the kitchen after 7. No adjusting the thermostat. No opening windows. No shower longer than 5 minutes. No television without headphones. No leaving the house without permission. Contribution fee $350 due Friday. The letters blurred as my lungs tightened. My disability check barely covered medication, and she knew it. Claire was not confused. She was in control. I pressed a hand to my cheek where Matt's slap still pulsed like a second heartbeat. I tried to swallow my fear and breathe evenly, but the more I read, the more suffocating the words became. My stomach growled, reminding me I hadn't eaten since yesterday morning. I wrapped myself in a sweater and stepped into the hallway. The house was silent, too silent, like it was waiting for me to make a mistake. When I went downstairs, the cold hit me first. Claire had lowered the thermostat so much that the hardwood floor felt like ice beneath my feet. My joints ached instantly. Matt's voice drifted from the living room. She's going to run up bills again, he muttered. Claire replied in a hushed tone, Good. She needs to understand she can't freeload. I swallowed and moved as quietly as I could. Every step felt like trespassing. When I reached the kitchen, I noticed my inhaler missing from the counter where I'd left it. After searching all the cabinets, I finally found it shoved behind a stack of pans I couldn't reach without climbing onto a chair. I stood on my toes, stretching my fingers toward the plastic tube. Matt entered just then. Digging for treasure, he asked, smirking. I needed my inhaler, I whispered. You should keep track of it then, he said. This house isn't your personal storage. He lit a cigarette without breaking eye contact and exhaled slowly. The smoke drifted over his shoulder toward me. I stepped back, tapping my chest lightly. He watched my struggle with an almost curious expression before turning away, leaving the cigarette burning in the ashtray. I made tea weak the way Claire insisted and retreated upstairs. I sipped it slowly, letting the warm steam soothe my throat. But the peace lasted only minutes. When I headed back down to wash the mug, a new object caught my eye. A small round camera mounted on the hallway wall pointed directly at the staircase, and more importantly, my bedroom door. I froze. Claire's voice floated behind me. Isn't it great? Now we have proof of everything that happens in this hallway. No one can accuse us of anything. My skin prickled. I didn't accuse. That's not the point, Claire said, brushing past me. This is for everyone's safety. But the lens stared at me like an unblinking eye. It wasn't there to protect me. It was there to monitor me. I returned to my room with a knot forming in my stomach. I needed fresh air, but when I opened the window, Claire appeared instantly as if summoned. What are you doing? She demanded. I just needed some fresh air, I said. It's February, she snapped. You're wasting heat. Shut it. I hesitated, and she reached past me and slammed the window. The gust of movement stirred dust into the air, making me cough. You need to be more considerate, she said coldly. Matt and I work hard to maintain this house. Don't make us regret our generosity. Generosity. The word felt poisonous. That afternoon, Claire handed me a white envelope with my name on it. Inside was the invoice for the household fee. $350, due in 4 days. I stared at her, stunned. Claire, I don't have that kind of money. She smiled tightly. Then you'll need to figure something out. We're not paying for your electricity and food on top of everything else. It's not fair, I whispered, hating myself for how weak my voice sounded. Life isn't fair, Anna, she said, shrugging. You of all people should know that. Later, while taking out the trash, another new chore, I saw Marjorie again. Her eyes landed immediately on the bruise. "Is that from a fall?" she asked. I shook my head before I could stop myself. "No, it's nothing." Her expression softened with concern. She lowered her voice. "Walls are thin," she said again, "and I've heard things." My breathing hitched. She continued before I could answer. "If you ever need help, just knock, or leave a note in my mailbox. You're not as alone as you think." I nodded, blinking rapidly to keep tears back. When I stepped back into the house, the warmth of Marjorie's words clung to me until the cold air swallowed it. The moment I climbed the stairs, I felt the pressure of eyes on me. The camera's red light blinked steadily, tracking my movements. I noticed something new. The vent above it puffed out a faint smoky draft, even though no one was smoking. The smell seeped into my room like a whisper. A threat. A reminder. I shut the door behind me and leaned against it. My breathing grew shallow as I stared at the list of house rules pinned to my wall. My fingers shook. Not from cold this time, but from anger rising like heat under my skin. I picked up the paper, tracing each line. No window, no thermostat, no movement after 7, no voice, no air, no dignity. My lungs tightened again this time, not from smoke or cold, but from the realization sinking into my bones. They weren't trying to help me. They weren't trying to support me. They were trying to control me. Every rule tightened their grip. Every violated boundary dimmed my existence. Every breath I took felt like permission I had to earn. That night, I lay awake listening to the house groan in the dark. Pipes shifted, vents hummed. The camera clicked faintly as it adjusted its lens. Every sound reminded me this place didn't want me here. Or worse, it wanted me here for the wrong reasons. My lungs wheezed as I pulled my blanket tighter and stared at the ceiling. The bruise on my cheek throbbed softly, echoing the reminder of Matt's hand and Claire's smirk. I whispered into the darkness more to myself than anyone else. I have to find a way out, before this house swallows me whole. The words drifted into the cold air and dissolved, but the resolve behind them stayed. For the first time since moving in, the fear did not smother me. It shaped something else. A small, sharp ember of defiance, and underneath that ember, the first fragile breath of a plan. The next few days slid by in a blur of cold air, stale smoke, and rules that grew heavier each time Claire printed a new version of them. I woke every morning with a pounding behind my eyes and a tightness in my chest that didn't loosen until midday if it loosened at all. My inhaler sat like a lifeline on my nightstand, but even it felt weaker now, as if each puff had to fight harder to keep me upright. One morning I reached for my sweater to guard against the cold seeping into the upstairs hallway. The thermostat read 58 degrees again. Claire insisted it was a necessary cutback to manage bills, but the rest of the house stayed warm. Only my room sat barely heated. The cold settled into my bones like a punishment meant to look like frugality. I opened the door, slowly pausing, when I noticed the faint smell of cigarette smoke drifting through the hallway vent. It wasn't strong, just enough to sting the back of my throat. Matt wasn't awake yet. Claire's feet never touched the floor before 8. So who had been smoking near the upstairs vent at dawn? My lungs tightened as I stepped into the hall. The camera blinked its little red light at me, watching, recording, measuring the seconds it took me to walk down the stairs. I kept my eyes forward, moving carefully, pretending not to notice the hum of the vent or the prickling fear gathering under my skin. The kitchen was empty except for the remains of last night's smoke hanging low, trapped by the closed windows Claire refused to open. When I reached for a glass to pour some water, I found the cabinet rearranged again. My inhaler wasn't in the spot I'd put it. My tea was pushed to the back. Everything felt touched, moved, sifted through. Claire watched me from the doorway, arms crossed, hair perfectly smoothed into a ponytail that made her look younger, calmer, less like the woman who wrote house rules prohibiting me from breathing the wrong way. "You need to stop losing your things," she said. I looked at the cabinet again, then back at her. I didn't lose anything. Someone moved it. "Are you accusing me?" Her eyebrow arched like a warning. "No, I just—" "Good," she snapped. Because I don't have time to track your stuff." I forced myself to inhale slowly through my mouth and released it through my nose. Each breath felt like dragging cold air across broken glass. Later that afternoon, Claire handed me a spray bottle and a rag. Her tone was sweet in a way that prickled my skin. "Clean the kitchen. And don't use too much soap. You always overdo it." I nodded, taking the bottle moving slowly because bending too fast made me lightheaded. As I wiped the counters, I heard Claire laugh softly at her phone, her voice drifting toward me like smoke through a cracked window. Every few minutes she peeked in, monitoring my progress like I was a teenager on chore duty. Halfway through wiping the lower cabinets, I reached up for the rag and saw that the vent above the kitchen door was pushing out a haze that shimmered gently in the light. Not thick enough to set off alarms, but enough to sting my nose. The coughing began before I could stand. Sharp, deep, the kind that made my ribs ache. I pressed my fist to my chest, struggling to steady myself. Claire rolled her eyes. "Anna, you're scaring the dog," she said. "They didn't even have a dog." I excused myself and climbed the stairs slowly. Each step felt like wading against a tide of heavy air. When I reached my room, I pressed the door shut behind me and leaned back against it, sliding down to sit on the floor. My breaths came short and uneven. I grabbed my inhaler, thankfully still on the nightstand, and took 2 puffs. The medicine opened my lungs just enough to quiet the panic without stopping the fear. Once my breath steadied, I lifted my head and saw something I hadn't noticed before: a slight discoloration around the vent in my room. Yellowish gray, smoke residue. I crawled to it and brushed my fingertip along the inside edge of the cover. My finger came away smudged with ash. A cold shiver ran through me. Smoke had been blown directly into my room. Deliberately. Someone had exhaled or burned something right at the vent intake. I tried to swallow, but my throat felt too tight. That evening, when Claire left her wine glass on the living room table and went upstairs, I took a moment to breathe in the absence of her presence. The house felt larger without her watching me. For a second, I thought about calling someone, anyone. But my contact list was full of people I hadn't spoken to in years. And shame has a way of anchoring you in silence. The silence didn't last long. Matt walked in from the garage, smelling like cold air and cigarette smoke. He glanced at me on the couch. "You're making the place smell like medicine," he said. "It's just my inhaler," I murmured. "Well, it's strong. Maybe use it outside." My jaw slackened. "It's freezing outside. Then don't use it so much." He flicked on the TV and turned the volume up until my chest vibrated with every explosion in whatever show he was watching. I pressed a hand over my sternum, trying to steady the tightness, and concentrated on breathing through the noise. The next day was worse. The cold hit harder. My chest hurt before I even got out of bed. The vent hissed softly above me, dispersing air that tasted faintly metallic. When I stepped into the hallway, the camera blinked again, recording each breath I took. I made it downstairs, searching for tea, something warm to soothe the ache beneath my ribs. Claire sat at the table, flipping through a stack of papers, bills, receipts, and something else. "What's that?" I asked. She smiled without warmth. "Just tracking costs." "For what for you?" she said. "Food, utilities, everything you use." "I want to be fair." I blinked. "I already pay the household fee. You pay a portion," she corrected. "Not enough for all the extra burden." Extra burden. The words hit harder than Matt's slap. I looked at the stack again. She was listing everything down to the number of tea bags missing from the box. I couldn't breathe for a moment. "You're charging me for food I don't eat," I said quietly. "You don't eat much, but you still breathe." "That costs money," she replied, flipping another page. My vision blurred, and for a second I thought I might faint. I gripped the edge of the table, steadying myself. Claire glanced up, annoyed. "Can you not do that?" "You look like you're about to drop dead, and that's not my responsibility." I left the room without answering. Outside, I found Marjorie trimming her shrubs. She straightened when she saw me and frowned. "You're pale as a ghost," she said. "Are you taking your treatments?" I nodded weakly. "It's just difficult here. She watched me, really watched me the way people do when they're trying to fit together pieces of a puzzle you're too tired to explain. "Anna," she said softly, stepping closer, "if something's wrong, you can tell me." My throat closed. Every instinct screamed to say nothing to protect Claire, to avoid escalating what was already unbearable. But Marjorie's eyes didn't judge. They held something like worry, something like truth. "I'm trying," was all I managed to whisper. She touched my arm gently. "Trying isn't the same as safe." I carried her words with me as I walked back inside. They pulsed louder than the hum of the vent, louder than the camera clicking, louder than the fear pressing down on me. By afternoon, the cold settled deeper in my bones. My joints stiffened, my breath shortened. I asked Claire if she'd consider raising the thermostat just a little. "We can't afford it," she said. "I can give you part of my check." "You already owe us," she cut in. "Don't add to the debt." Debt. She called my existence a debt. That evening, as I stood at the kitchen sink washing dishes, I reached for a towel and knocked over a glass. It shattered. The noise echoed through the house. Matt was there in seconds, looming over me. "Can't you do anything without breaking something?" he growled. I'm sorry. I didn't mean—" "You never mean anything," he said. "You just cause problems." His voice lowered further, almost a whisper. "Don't make more of them. Understand?" I nodded quickly, throat tight. He stepped back and I sucked in a shaky breath. My lungs burned from how long I'd held the air in. Upstairs, the vent hissed again. I sat on the edge of my bed, fingers shaking as I touched the yellowed edge of the vent. Why was it discolored? Why wasn't the rest of the house affected? Why did the smoke always drift into my room first? The truth pressed against my ribs. Someone was blowing smoke into the system, directly into the duct that fed my room. I didn't know why. I didn't know how long. I didn't know what would happen next. But for the first time since moving into this house, I let myself consider a terrifying possibility. This wasn't just neglect. This wasn't just cruelty. This was control. A slow suffocation disguised as inconvenience. And I was running out of air. I lay back, staring at the ceiling until the lines blurred. My breath rattled softly, each inhale a reminder that time was thinning around me, just like the oxygen in this room. I closed my eyes and whispered into the darkness. Something is wrong. Something is very, very wrong. And finally, the part of me that always tried to excuse everything went quiet. The cold woke me before the sun did. It curled beneath the door, slid over the hardwood floor, and settled against my skin like frost. My breath came out in a pale cloud, visible even in the dim morning light. The thermostat in the hallway still showed 58 degrees. No matter how many sweaters I layered on the cold, always found a way in seeping into my bones, tightening my lungs, making every inhale feel like swallowing winter air. I sat on the edge of my bed, hugging my arms around myself until the coughing began, soft at first, then sharp, rattling, spiking pressure behind my eyes. I braced both hands against my knees and waited for the fit to pass. It always passed eventually, but each time it took a little more out of me. When I finally stood, I felt lightheaded, the floor tilting slightly beneath me. I steadied myself against the wall and reached for the doorknob. The moment I opened the door, heat from downstairs drifted up the staircase, just enough to remind me that the rest of the house was warm. Only my room remained a refrigerated box. I descended slowly each step, making my joints ache. In the kitchen, I found the vent above the pantry humming softly. That faint scent of cigarette smoke curled from it again, not overpowering, just enough to sting the back of my throat. I pressed my lips together, forcing myself not to cough. Claire was already awake, standing by the counter in her pristine yoga pants, scrolling through her phone. She didn't look up. "I thought you were still asleep," she said casually. My voice cracked. "It's too cold upstairs." "It's fine," she said without glancing at me. "It keeps the energy bill down." "For my room only." She paused for half a second, barely noticeable, before responding. "The upstairs vents are old, you know that. but I'd lived in enough places to know the difference between old and adjusted. The heat wasn't broken. It was deliberate. I poured water into a mug for tea, trying to steady my trembling hands, when Claire suddenly looked up. "You left the window unlocked yesterday. I cracked it open for air," I said. "I closed it." "You didn't lock it," she snapped. "Anyone could have broken in." "The house has a camera system. That doesn't matter," she said, cutting me off. "If you're going to be here, you need to be responsible." Her tone sliced through me sharper than the cold did. I nodded and took my tea upstairs. Claire followed. She stood in my doorway without knocking again. Her eyes scanned my room as if taking inventory. "We need to go over a few more updates," she said. "For the house rules." I clenched my jaw, trying not to flinch. "You've been using too much hot water. Your showers need to be shorter." I inhaled slowly. "They're already short." "Then make them shorter." She stepped further into the room and picked up my medication bottles, reading labels like she had authority over them. "And this nebulizer is loud. You should do treatments when Matt and I aren't home." "My breathing." "Nobody is saying you can't breathe," she said, voice flat. "Just be considerate." She placed the bottles back without aligning them the way they were before she touched them. The disordered row made the room feel tilted. When she finally walked away, I sat on the bed and pressed both hands against my face until the urge to scream dissolved into a quiet exhale. I tried to distract myself by cleaning. Cleaning made me feel useful, needed, maybe even welcome. But when I finished making the bed and turned toward the door, Claire stood there again. I didn't hear her approach. "You fold your sheets wrong," she said. I froze. "I've been making beds for decades, Claire." She smiled thinly. "Not like this." She walked away, leaving me with the sheets half smoothed, half crumpled, and a feeling inside my chest like my ribs were tightening around my lungs. By late morning, the cold in my room felt sharper than before. I touched the vent above my pillow. It was blowing more aggressively today. The draft carried that same faint bitterness, the residue of someone else's habit drifting through the metal lungs of the house. A shiver ran down my spine. As I stepped outside to retrieve the mail later, I spotted Marjorie from next door. She was watering a row of frost-resistant shrubs, her breath forming small white clouds. When she looked up and saw me, her expression shifted instantly. "You look worse," she said softly. "Is everything all right?" I tried to smile. "Just cold and tired." "You've been coughing more," she observed. "Even last night, I heard it through my window. I opened my mouth to apologize, but she waved a hand. "No need for that. I just want to make sure you're okay." The kindness in her voice made something inside me tremble. "I'm managing," I said. She stepped closer. "If you ever need anything at all, just knock. Or leave a note if she's watching." My throat tightened. "Thank you." Marjorie held my gaze for a long moment before lowering her voice. "Your sister doesn't seem herself lately." I didn't trust my voice enough to respond, so I nodded instead. She squeezed my arm gently before returning to her shrubs. When I re-entered the house, warmth hit me immediately, thick, heavy, concentrated downstairs, nowhere upstairs. I climbed the staircase slowly, aware of the camera following my movement. I could almost feel its gaze pricking the back of my neck. Cold air poured from the vent outside my door. My room felt like a tomb waiting to be sealed. I stepped inside and closed the door behind me. My phone buzzed on the nightstand. A text from Claire: "Do not go outside without telling me first. We have routines here. Don't disrupt them." Routines. As if my existence was a disruption to the rhythm of their lives. My chest tightened again, not from COPD this time, but from anger tightening like a fist around my lungs. I lay back on the bed, staring at the ceiling cracks I hadn't noticed before. Thin lines spreading outward, almost delicate. They looked like fractures, hairline breaks, forming long before the structure gives way. That evening, Claire cooked pasta. The smell drifted through the house, warm and inviting, reminding me of childhood nights when she'd beg me to stir the pot for her because she didn't want to burn her hands. Memories felt dangerous now. They made me hesitate. They made me hope. and hope made me vulnerable. Matt came home smelling of cold air and cigarette smoke. He brushed past me in the hallway without acknowledgement. When he reached the kitchen, he kissed Claire's cheek and murmured something that made her laugh. Her laugh clanged in my ears like a door slamming shut. Later, as I poured myself a tiny bowl of pasta because any more would be noted, Claire leaned against the counter. "You've been using a lot of electricity," she said. I don't think so. The heater in your room runs all night. It's freezing in there. You could use extra blankets." "I already do." She sighed dramatically as if I were a child testing her patience. "Then figure something out. We're not made of money." Matt snorted without looking up from his phone. My pulse beat loudly in my ears. The air felt thick again. I finished eating in silence and went upstairs before they could find anything else to scold me for. When I reached my room, the cold slapped me full in the face. It was colder than before. I crossed to the vent and lifted my hand to it. A strong draft blew against my fingers, but it wasn't just cold air, it held the faint, bitter tang of smoke again. My lungs seized before I could turn away. A coughing fit ripped through me, dragging me to my knees. I grabbed the nightstand for support and knocked my inhaler to the floor. My vision blurred as I reached for it. As I tried to breathe, I heard footsteps outside my door. Claire's voice drifted into the room as casual as ever. "You really need to stop overreacting to everything she said. It's exhausting," I gasped for breath, unable to answer. After a moment, her footsteps retreated. I stayed on the floor until the cough subsided, until I could breathe without tasting blood at the back of my throat. The house had grown quieter by then. Too quiet. I crawled toward the vent and touched it again. More residue smeared onto my fingertips. Someone had been manipulating the airflow. Someone had been pushing smoke through the system. My lungs heaved once more. This wasn't accidental. This wasn't neglect. This was targeted, controlled, deliberate. That night, as I lay beneath my blankets, shivering in a room cold enough to numb my fingers, something inside me shifted. I stopped asking myself why they treated me this way. Instead, I asked how far they planned to go, and how long I could survive it. When the house finally went quiet, I whispered my first unfiltered truth into the darkness. This house wants me gone. But the more terrifying thought followed right after. And they know it. I woke before dawn with the unsettling certainty that if I didn't act soon, something irreversible would happen to me in this house. My lungs were tighter than they had ever been, each inhale a negotiation, each exhale a prayer. The cold in my room felt more deliberate than accidental, like hands pressing against my chest from the inside. I sat up, slowly reaching for my notebook on the nightstand. The pages held only a few scribbles, so far dates fragments, moments I didn't want to forget even when I wished I could. Last night's smear of ash from the vent marked the most recent entry. I stared at the note until the words blurred. Outside the room I heard footsteps, slow, drawn out, careful. Someone paused right outside my door. I froze, holding my breath. A shadow moved under the doorframe, then lingered before finally fading down the hall. Whoever it was had been listening. I clutched the notebook to my chest and whispered to myself, I can't survive this alone. The thought wasn't dramatic. It was factual. My lungs were losing the war. The house was suffocating me. Claire and Matt were squeezing tighter each day. If I didn't send a signal now, I wouldn't make it to whatever tomorrow meant to them. I grabbed my phone and pulled the blanket over my head, creating a small pocket of warmth where my breath didn't sting so sharply. I typed slowly, searching for anything that could help. Vulnerable adult rights. COPD abuse household. Legal help for at-risk adults. Most of the results felt too big, too far, too theoretical. I scrolled until a small line of text caught my eye. Local legal aid hotline, free confidential assistance. My pulse quickened. I hesitated. Calling meant stepping out of the fog of denial, the one that kept telling me this was family, this was temporary, this was survivable. But the bruise on my cheek told another story. I pressed the number. A man answered on the first ring. Legal aid. This is Daniel. My breath hitched. Hi. I'm not sure if this is the right place. His voice softened immediately. Take your time. Are you safe to talk? I looked at the door, imagining the shadow still standing there waiting. I think so, I whispered. What's your name? He asked. Anna. Anna, are you in immediate danger right now? I don't know, I said honestly. But I think something is very wrong. I told him about the smoke in the vents, the slap, the cold room, the missing inhaler, the rules, the camera, the suffocating growing dread. My voice broke twice, and each time he waited patiently. When I finished, Daniel's tone changed not to sympathy, but to a kind of steel-edged clarity. Anna, he said quietly, what you're describing is not just unhealthy, it's abusive, and parts of it are criminal. My chest tightened. I don't want to get my sister in trouble. You need to prioritize staying alive, he said firmly. What's happening to you cannot continue. A tear slipped down my cheek before I could stop it. Hearing someone say the words I'd been choking on made everything too real. What do? I whispered. First, he said, you document everything. Photos, audio timestamps, receipts. Anything unusual, save it. Second, do not confront them. Let them believe nothing has changed. Third, call me if anything escalates. And lastly, he paused, letting the silence strengthen the words to come. You are not alone. I'm with you now. A soft sob escaped me. I covered my mouth, afraid someone downstairs might hear. Anna, he added, you're doing the right thing. After the call, I hid the notebook inside the lining of an old winter coat folded in the back of my closet. Then I tucked my phone under my mattress, not far enough to lose access, but far enough that Claire wouldn't find it if she barged in again. And she did. Later that morning, she entered my room without knocking again, making my shoulders tense instantly. You're up early, she observed, eyes scanning every corner like she was taking mental inventory. I couldn't sleep, I said. Well, try, she replied sharply. Matt has a big presentation today and he doesn't need distractions. And don't go outside without telling me first. I nodded because nodding was easier than breathing through another interrogation. After she left, I waited a full minute before taking out my phone and testing the audio recorder. I pressed record and whispered into it March 5th. Claire came into my room without knocking. She said I'm not allowed outside without her permission. Hearing my own voice say it felt foreign, too calm for the storm around me. But Daniel was right. Evidence mattered. And this was the first brick. The day passed slowly, every hour stretched thin by fear and cold. I kept my movements measured so they wouldn't ask questions. I cleaned the counters quietly. I folded laundry silently. Every few minutes I checked that the phone was still hidden in my pocket, recording anything useful. That afternoon, something shifted. I caught Claire looking at me strangely. Her eyes narrowed, head tilted slightly. Not curious, suspicious. She approached slowly. Why are you carrying your phone around so much? My stomach lurched. I like listening to music. You don't listen to music, she said flatly. I swallowed. I'm trying something new. She stared another second too long before walking away. The fear that surged through me was sharp and metallic like ice cutting through warm skin. But beneath it, something else flickered. Resolve. That evening, when Claire was occupied in the kitchen, I stepped out to the backyard under the pretense of checking if the trash bins needed rolling in. The icy air hit my lungs and pushed a few coughing fits forward, but I forced myself through them. I needed to speak to Marjorie. She spotted me immediately and walked over, eyes filled with concern. You look terrible, she said gently. Worse than yesterday? I'm okay, I lied. No, you're not. Her directness broke me a little. I exhaled shakily. Marjorie. Something's happening in that house, she nodded. I know, my head jerked up. You do? She looked around before lowering her voice. I hear things. The yelling, the way he talks to you. And that coughing. Good God, dear, I hear it through the walls. You sound like you're drowning. Tears pricked my eyes. I I don't know what to do. Marjorie touched my arm. Start writing everything down. Everything. Don't rely on your memory when you're scared. I already am, I whispered. Good. Keep going. And Anna. Yes. If they try to make you feel crazy, remember you're not. Her words followed me back into the house like a shield of warmth I wasn't sure I deserved. Night fell thick and heavy. Claire and Matt retreated upstairs early, leaving the downstairs in a quiet gloom. I crept out of my room to check the hallway vent again. A faint haze curled out smoke so thin it might have been imagined if not for the acrid sting it sent through my nostrils. I pressed record on my phone. Footsteps approached fast. Matt appeared at the end of the hallway, filling the narrow space with his height and presence. He stared at me for a long moment, lips curving into something between irritation and amusement. "Why are you always wandering around at night?" he asked. "I'm just getting water." "You don't need to do that," he said, stepping forward until he was too close, too solid. "Stay in your room. It's better for everyone." My knees trembled. I didn't mean to cause trouble." "You never do," he murmured. "But you always do." He tapped the camera near the staircase with 2 fingers, the gesture slow and taunting. "Just remember," he said quietly, "we see everything." He walked away before I could breathe properly again. I closed my door and pressed my back to it, sliding down until I was sitting on the floor. My heart pounded. My lungs struggled to find a rhythm. But the phone in my pocket was still recording. His threat was captured. And for the first time since moving into this house, fear didn't shut me down. It sharpened me. I whispered into the dark, into the small pool of air that was still mine. "You don't know that I'm watching you back." Outside, the vents hummed. Smoke drifted. The camera blinked. But something had changed. I had taken my first step out of silent suffering. And there was no going back. I woke with a strange kind of determination humming beneath my ribs, something that didn't come from strength, but from desperation that had finally learned how to stand. My lungs still burned from the night before. The cold still pooled in my room like a fog that refused to lift. But something inside me felt steadier. Maybe Daniel's voice lingered there. Maybe Marjorie's concern. Maybe the quiet defiance that had taken root under my skin. Evidence, Daniel had said. Evidence is survival. I sat up slowly, reaching for my phone hidden beneath the blanket. My fingers trembled as I opened the recorder app. I whispered the date and the time, then set the phone aside. Next, I took the tiny recorder Daniel had mailed me, packed discreetly in a padded envelope, addressed only to my initials, and read the instructions twice before I dared place it behind the decorative plant in the hallway. The leaves draped over it perfectly. Anyone glancing by would never know a small red light blinked beneath them. As I straightened the plant, I heard Claire humming downstairs, an eerily bright tune that made my stomach twist. She only hummed when she was satisfied or preparing to scold someone. I couldn't tell which it would be today. I crept down the stairs, slowly letting the recorder capture every footstep and every murmur. When I reached the kitchen doorway, I steadied my breathing and listened. Claire spoke quietly to herself as she wiped the counter. "She's been too calm lately," she muttered. "Maybe she's finally learning." My skin prickled. If only she knew what that calmness meant. I stepped into the kitchen. Claire looked up, her eyes widening a fraction, surprised I'd appeared without coughing first. She recovered quickly and offered a tight smile. "You're up early again," she said. "I couldn't sleep." "Then rest more." She walked past me, brushing my shoulder with a deliberate coldness. "Matt and I don't need you wandering the house all hours. It's unsettling." I nodded, though I knew she didn't care about my agreement. In the afternoon, with Claire busy reorganizing cabinets for no reason beyond asserting control, I slipped into the corner of the hallway near the recorder. Her voice drifted through clearly. "I swear if she uses that machine again while Matt is home, he's going to lose it." She laughed. I pressed my tongue to the roof of my mouth to keep from making a sound. Matt returned that evening, just as the sun dipped behind the rooftops. I heard his heavy steps and stiff movements before he even entered the kitchen. He smelled like cold air and stale smoke. He was irritated his version of tired, which meant danger. As he passed me in the hallway, he paused. "You're using too much electricity," he said. "I haven't the machine. It runs all night." "It has to," I murmured. "Well, he said stepping closer, maybe you should sleep less." The recorder caught everything. After dinner, if 2 spoonfuls of pasta could be called dinner, I climbed the stairs and slipped into my room. I turned on the phone to review the hallway recording just long enough to hear Claire's earlier whisper, "If she slips up again, don't help her. Let it play out." A chill ran down my spine. Let it play out. A phrase that sounded less like frustration and more like intent. I backed up the audio onto the USB Marjorie had given me, the one disguised as a cheap souvenir keychain. I'd tucked it into the inner pocket of my coat earlier, and now I hid it even deeper, sliding it into the seam beneath the lining. If Claire searched the coat, she'd never find it. The next morning brought another discovery. As I vacuumed the upstairs hallway loudly enough that no one would wonder why I was moving slowly or touching the vent, I noticed Claire's office door slightly ajar. She normally kept it locked, but luck or carelessness had left it open by an inch. My pulse quickened. I slipped inside. Papers lay scattered across her desk, bills, sticky notes, a list titled "Projected Monthly Income," and a printed form from the state's caregiver stipend program. My name was written neatly at the top next to the classification Vulnerable Adult High Dependency. The application date was 2 weeks before I'd moved in. A cold weight settled in my stomach. They hadn't taken me in out of kindness. They'd brought me here expecting profit. I swallowed hard and snapped a quick photo, then another. My hands shook, my breath trembled. Footsteps sounded on the stairs. I rushed out, pressing the vacuum switch just before Claire appeared in the doorway. "What are you doing?" she asked sharply. "Just cleaning," I said, keeping my face lowered so she wouldn't see how pale I had gone. She stared at me for a moment too long before walking away. I didn't move until her footsteps faded downstairs. That night when I told Marjorie I needed to talk, she met me in the shadowed corner of her yard. Her breath puffed into the cold air and she looked both worried and determined. "You're getting worse," she said. "I can hear it." "Claire and Matt," I began, then faltered. Marjorie stepped closer. "Anna, tell me." I told her about the smoke, the room, the slap, the cold, the rules, the hidden documents. Not everything, but enough. Enough to see her expression change, sympathy melting into anger. She reached into her jacket pocket and handed me a bag of grocery staples, throat lozenges, the tea she'd noticed I favored, a small box of cough drops. "You hide that," she said. "Don't let them know I gave you anything." Then she pressed a small USB case into my palm. "In case your phone breaks," she whispered. "In case they break it." My throat tightened. "Why are you helping me?" She held my gaze. "Because I've seen women disappear in homes like this. I'm not letting you be one of them." When I returned to the house, the cold felt sharper, as if the walls had overheard everything. I climbed the stairs and paused, hearing the faintest scraping sound near my door. The vent hissed and pushed out a draft that smelled different tonight. Stronger, dirtier, unmistakably contaminated with smoke. My lungs seized, instantly jerking a cough from deep inside me. I dropped to my knees. The nebulizer sat beside my bed, but when I reached for it, the water chamber was bone dry. I'd filled it that morning. Someone had emptied it. My body shook as I struggled to draw in enough air to stay conscious. I grabbed the inhaler and took 2 puffs, then 2 more. The wheezing eased only slightly. Exhaustion settled over me like a heavy blanket. When the coughing finally slowed, I stayed on the floor too weak to stand staring at the vent with resentment hot as fever. This wasn't an accident. This wasn't neglect. This was a pattern. And patterns could be proven. Late that night, while reviewing the day's recordings from my phone, I heard something else, something I hadn't caught earlier. Matt's voice low and irritated, "She's getting harder to control." Then Claire's reply. "Then we need to speed things up." My skin crawled. Speed what up? What was left to speed? My heart pounded as I backed up the files onto the USB. I tucked it into my coat, then tucked the coat into a bag under my bed. If they snooped again, I needed layers of protection. Around midnight, I stepped out to get water, chest still aching. The hallway was dark except for the dim glow of the camera's red light. Then Matt appeared at the far end of the hall, silent, looming shoulders tense. He didn't move at first, just stared. It was a long, cold stare. Then he stepped forward, slowly, deliberately. Every movement calculated. "You're making everything harder for yourself," he murmured, his voice low and calm, in a way that chilled my blood. He tapped the camera again, his fingers clicking against the plastic dome. "Remember," he said, leaning closer, "we see everything." I closed my door the moment he walked away, locking it, even though Claire had told me locks were a sign of distrust. My lungs felt tight, but this time it wasn't only physical. I sat on my bed wrapped in blankets, gripping my phone. Fear still lived in my body, but something else did too, a pulse of determination that beat harder each time they underestimated me. I whispered into the darkness, into the cold air that no longer felt like it belonged to this house. "You don't know that I'm watching you back." And for the first night since I moved in, I didn't feel entirely helpless. I felt ready. Tomorrow, she won't see it coming. Claire's words from the night before clung to me like a cold sweat as I opened my eyes. The sky outside my window was still dark, the kind of early hour where even birds hesitate to break the silence. My lungs were already tight, as if they sensed something in the air before I did. I pushed myself upright, coughing softly until the fit receded. I dreaded leaving my room, but staying inside felt worse. The cold bit at my skin the second I opened the door. The camera blinked awake at my movement, its red light blinking like a pulse. Downstairs I heard murmured whispers and the clinking of dishes. Claire and Matt never woke this early. It was unusual enough to spike my heartbeat. The murmur stopped abruptly when my foot hit the bottom step. I entered the kitchen slowly. Claire stood beside the sink, her hair pulled back, her expression too still. Matt leaned against the fridge, arms crossed, cigarette already smoldering between his fingers. They both stared at me as though they had rehearsed this moment. "You look tired," Claire said brightly. "Too brightly. Maybe stay in your room today. Rest." Her tone wasn't a suggestion. It was a command. I just need my morning tea," I whispered, trying to steady my breathing. The air in the kitchen was heavy with smoke. Matt smirked and flicked ash into the sink. "You should really stop complaining so much. The drama gets old." I swallowed hard and reached for a mug. My hands shook not from weakness, but from the instinctive fear that traveled up my spine whenever he looked at me like that. When I turned toward the pantry to grab tea, the room seemed to shift. Matt stepped closer. Too close. I could smell the smoke on his clothes before I saw the cigarette in his fingers. He inhaled once, long, deliberate, then exhaled a stream of smoke in my direction. It hit me like a wave. My throat seized first, then the burning sank deep into my chest. I coughed, doubling over, slightly gripping the counter to steady myself. "Matt, please," I gasped. "You know I can't. You can't," what he said. "Handle a little smoke, that's your problem, not mine." I felt the world tilt. Claire watched from the doorway, arms crossed, face unreadable. "Matt," I managed, voice cracking between coughs. "Please don't." Smoke in my face. He stepped closer, invading the space between us, until the heat of his breath hit my cheek. "You don't get to tell me what to do in my house," he murmured. He took another drag and exhaled directly at me. My lungs convulsed instantly. Pain shot through my ribs. I grabbed the counter because my knees buckled. Each breath felt smaller than the last. My airway was narrowing too quickly, like a fist squeezing from the inside. "I can't breathe," I wheezed. Claire's lips curled slightly. Not a smile, something colder. "You're always making everything about you," she said. "Just calm down." I stumbled toward my inhaler on the table, but when I reached for it, my fingers hit empty air. It wasn't where I left it. I dropped to my knees, frantic, searching the floor. Each second burned. "My inhaler," I rasped. "Where is it?" Matt shrugged. Maybe you should keep better track of your stuff. My vision pulsed, my hearing buzzed. I crawled toward my room, remembering the nebulizer beside the bed, but when I tried to use it earlier, the tubing felt loose. Had someone touched it? Sabotaged it. My hands shook as I reached for the machine now. The tubing detached with a soft pop. The chamber was empty again. Dry. Useless. No, I gasped. Claire appeared behind me. You really should be more careful with your equipment. The world darkened around the edges. I felt myself sliding downward, knees hitting the floor. My breath came in thin, high-pitched gasps. My chest spasmed violently. Somewhere behind me, Matt sighed loudly. Maybe call 911, he said lazily. She's being dramatic again. I forced the words out. Phone, my phone. Claire looked at me with a tilt of her head like my suffering bored her. You don't need your phone. Just breathe. I can't, I wheezed. Claire stepped aside and walked away. Matt tossed something toward me. My inhaler. It clattered against the floor and slid under the dresser. My vision blurred. I crawled toward it, blind, desperate. My lungs screamed for air, but my body refused to comply. I couldn't get a full inhale. Each one was a tiny, strangled breath that made my ribs shake. Just as my fingers brushed the edge of the inhaler, I collapsed forward. Panic surged through me, sharp, cold total. Air. I needed air. I fumbled for my phone fingers, trembling violently. Somehow, through the fog in my head, I managed to swipe and hit 911. A thin whisper escaped me. Help! Can't breathe! The dispatcher's voice crackled. Stay with me. Help is coming. Can you tell me what happened? Smoke, can't breathe. COPD. My voice dissolved into a violent coughing fit. Claire shouted from the hallway. Hang up. You're making things worse. I clutched the phone tighter, pressing it to my ear. The dispatcher's voice steadied me. Don't hang up. Help is on the way. The front door burst open moments later. Paramedics rushed in, their voices sharp and urgent. She's cyanotic, get oxygen on her now. Check the airway. Move her carefully. Don't jostle her chest. Hands lifted me gently. A mask covered my face. Cold oxygen flooded my lungs, shocking them awake. I coughed hard, but air finally filled the spaces that had been starved. My vision sharpened slowly. One paramedic glanced at the inhaler lying half-hidden under the dresser. Why was this all the way under here? He asked. Matt replied instantly, she drops things. The paramedic didn't look convinced. Another paramedic lifted the nebulizer and frowned. It's empty, and the tubing isn't attached. Did she use this recently? Claire's voice rose. She panics. She's always doing things wrong. The paramedics exchanged glances, serious ones, cautious ones. They weren't buying the excuses. The police arrived next. This time, they didn't treat it as a simple misunderstanding. One officer knelt beside me as I tried to breathe steadily through the oxygen mask. Ma'am, he asked gently, are you safe in this home? I shook my head weakly. No, I whispered. I'm not. Matt scoffed behind him. She's exaggerating, sir. The officer snapped, step back. As they lifted me onto the stretcher, Claire followed closely, demanding answers, insisting the paramedics were overreacting. You don't understand her condition, she said sharply. She gets overly dramatic. But the paramedic closest to me cut her off. She's in respiratory distress. This isn't drama. They wheeled me toward the ambulance, and for the first time in weeks, I felt the air begin to lighten, not because my lungs were healed, but because someone finally believed me. From the stretcher, I saw Claire's face shift from frustration to fear. Real fear. Matt's jaw tightened, his hands clenched at his sides. For the first time, I wasn't the only one gasping. As the doors closed, the paramedic leaned toward me. APS has been notified, he said softly. You're not going back there tonight. A single tear slid down my cheek, not from pain, but from something close to relief. As the ambulance pulled away, Claire's voice echoed faintly behind us. Anna, don't do this. You're ruining everything." But they had already ruined everything long before I dialed 911. Inside the ambulance, hooked to oxygen, listening to the hum of machinery keeping my lungs steady, I felt something shift deep inside me. This wasn't just survival anymore. This was the beginning of an ending I hadn't dared imagine. And for the first time, I didn't feel powerless. I felt the air returning slowly, painfully, triumphantly. This was the moment everything changed. I woke to the hushed beeping of a hospital monitor, the soft hum of filtered air, and a stillness so foreign it made me uncomfortable. For the first time in months, I wasn't cold. I wasn't coughing. I wasn't listening for footsteps outside my door. The sheets were warm, the room quiet, and breathing didn't feel like lifting a boulder inside my chest. But the relief was fragile. Every breath reminded me I wasn't in my room anymore because I couldn't go back. And the thought of Claire or Matt walking through the hospital doors sent a chill down the center of my spine. A nurse stepped in with a kind smile. "Morning, Anna." "How's the breathing better?" I whispered. "I think." "You're safe here," she said gently, adjusting the oxygen tube resting under my nose. "APS has been notified. You won't be discharged back to that home." The words felt unreal, like oxygen for my mind, not just my lungs. I blinked back tears and nodded. Just as the nurse left, another woman entered, her posture straight, but her expression warm. She carried a folder and a tablet. Her badge read, APS Investigator Linda Carver. "Good morning, Anna," she said softly as she took a seat beside my bed. "I'm here to help you." "Is this an okay time to talk?" I nodded slowly. My throat tightened, but this time the emotion wasn't fear. It was the strange weight of being believed. Linda opened her folder. "First, I want you to know this conversation is completely confidential. I'm going to ask you some difficult questions. But you're safe. No one can hurt you right now. Safe." The word landed in my chest like sunlight. She began gently, "Can you tell me what happened yesterday?" My voice shook as I spoke. He blew smoke directly at me. I asked him not to, and then I couldn't breathe. Has this happened before? Smoke in the vents, sabotaged equipment, cold in my room, the rules, the slap. Her pen paused. "Slap," she repeated softly. "Yes," I whispered. "A few days ago. Matt hit me. Did you report it?" "I tried," I said. "But the police. Claire talked for me. They said there wasn't enough proof." Linda's jaw tightened slightly, but her voice stayed calm. "Tell me everything, even the small details." For the first time I did. The smoke, the cold upstairs, the camera pointed at my door, the locked pantry, the missing inhaler, the disassembled nebulizer, the rules, the invoices, the way Claire watched me like she was waiting for something, the feeling of being observed constantly, even in silence. When I finished, my lungs trembled, not from weakness, but from the sheer weight of releasing months of held breath. Linda nodded slowly, compassion in her eyes. "Anna, this isn't just neglect. Some of what you described is consistent with intentional endangerment." The words hit me harder than any slap could. Intentional. Endangerment. She continued, "Do you have any evidence?" My hands shook as I lifted my phone from the bedside table. "I recorded some things. And I took pictures." Linda leaned forward. "May I see them?" I opened the first recording, the one where Matt threatened me in the hallway. The audio crackled, his voice cold and unmistakable. "You're making everything harder for yourself." After it ended, Linda's lips pressed into a thin line. Then I showed photos. The yellowed vent, the disconnected tubing, the bruise on my cheek, the cracked invoices, the thermostat locked at 58 degrees. She looked at them one by one, and each time her expression grew more severe. "Anna," she said, "you've done something incredibly important. Many victims never gather evidence. What you have here is substantial." My throat tightened. "So, I'm not imagining it." She shook her head firmly. "No, you're not." Before she could continue, another knock sounded at the door. Daniel stepped in, followed by a tall woman carrying a camera bag. Anna, Daniel said gently, "This is Riley Hart. She's an investigative journalist. I asked her to join us off the record for now." Riley approached with a professional but compassionate demeanor. "I'll only take notes if you allow it. And nothing will ever be published with your name." I tensed. "I don't want a story." Riley nodded. "I understand. But hearing what happened to you, I think your voice could help others. There's been a spike in vulnerable adult abuse in the area, cases hidden inside families that look perfect on the outside." I lowered my eyes. "I'm not perfect. I'm sick." "That's why they targeted you," she said softly. "Not because you're weak, because you're kind, trusting, and dependent on them. That's the pattern." Her words made my chest ache. Before I could respond, Linda's tablet buzzed. She glanced at it, then looked up at me. "Anna," she said, "APS is at the house right now." My breath hitched. "Already we expedite cases like yours," Linda explained. "Given your medical emergency and the evidence, we're conducting an unannounced visit." My pulse fluttered. "What are they doing?" "Inspecting living conditions, photographing your room, interviewing Claire and Matt." Daniel added, "And they can't refuse." My mind raced. What if Claire lies? Linda gave a faint smile. "People like Claire don't just lie, they over-explain. They contradict themselves, and they panic." I wanted to believe her. A nurse arrived to check my oxygen levels, giving the investigators a moment to step aside. After she left, Daniel sat on the edge of the chair. "Anna," he said, "there's something else we need to discuss." But before he could continue, a soft knock came at the door. "Come in," I said. Marjorie stepped inside with a small bag in her hands. Her eyes watered when she saw me sitting up, breathing steadier than the last time she'd seen me. "Oh, sweetheart," she said, crossing the room and hugging me gently. "You scared me half to death yesterday." "I didn't mean to," I whispered, emotion cracking in my voice. She set the bag beside me. Inside was a small box of my favorite tea, a jar of honey, and a handwritten card that simply said, "You matter." I pressed the card to my chest. Marjorie turned toward Linda. "I'm willing to give a statement. I've been hearing things for weeks." I recorded something too when Matt screamed at her. Linda's posture shifted with approval. "Your statement will help us tremendously." Marjorie nodded. "She's been coughing every night. You can hear it through the walls. And the way they talk to her? No human being deserves that." Riley exchanged a meaningful glance with Daniel. Another witness. Another piece of truth. Linda's tablet buzzed again. She glanced at it and her expression sharpened. "APS inspectors just reported something significant," she said. "They collected air samples from your vent, Anna. The smoke concentration in your room was 4 times higher than anywhere else in the house." I felt my stomach lurch. So it was intentional. "There's no innocent explanation," Linda said. Daniel added, "And we're not done yet." A few minutes later, Linda received a new update. Her face changed entirely. "Anna," she said slowly, "APS found something else on Claire's computer." My breath stalled. What drafted application for a caregiver stipend? And based on the timestamps, she prepared it before you ever moved in. Riley's eyes widened. So they planned this. Daniel nodded grimly. "Your sister didn't take you in out of compassion. She took you in as income." My lungs tightened, not from illness this time, but from a grief so deep it hollowed out my chest. "My own sister," I whispered. Marjorie reached out and touched my hand. "You deserved love, not exploitation." Linda closed her folder. "Anna, you should know you will not be going back to that house. APS has made our initial recommendation." "What is it," I breathed, "that you be permanently removed from the residence," she said, "for your safety, effective immediately." I stared at her, stunned. Permanently removed. No returning. No obligations to them. No more cold air. No more smoke. No more fear. The concept of freedom felt too big to hold. Later that evening, after Daniel left to prepare documents and Linda went to finalize housing arrangements, I lay back in the hospital bed and closed my eyes. The oxygen flowed gently, keeping my breath steady. For the first time in months, I wasn't waiting for footsteps outside my door, or listening for the hiss of a vent, or fearing the hand that might strike me. Instead, for the first time, the air felt like it belonged to me. And tomorrow I wouldn't be going back to that house of smoke. Tomorrow I would begin to breathe again. The next 48 hours unfolded like a storm, quiet at first, then violent, then strangely calm in the aftermath. I remained in the hospital under observation, hooked to oxygen and pulse monitors, while APS and the police worked in the background. I didn't see any of it, but I felt every tremor through the updates Linda brought to my bedside. On the third morning, Linda entered my room with a folder so thick it looked painful to carry. She set it on the table, took a breath, and said, "Anna, things escalated at the house." I gripped the blanket. "What happened?" "They confronted your sister and her husband. It didn't go well." My heart fluttered. Did they deny everything?" Linda gave a humorless smile. "Not at first. Claire tried to act shocked, claimed she had always cared for you. Then Matt got defensive. Too defensive. He said APS was blowing things out of proportion." "That sounds like him," I whispered. He also yelled, Linda added. "A lot, in front of officers." I closed my eyes. I could picture it perfectly, Matt looming over them, veins tight in his neck, barking at anyone who challenged him. Claire melting into a performance of innocence with a trembling hand pressed to her chest. Linda continued. "It got worse. They tried to stop us from entering your room. Claimed they had a right to privacy." "You got in anyway?" I asked. "We had legal grounds," she said, "and once we opened the door, it was obvious." She slid a photo across the table, a glossy print of my room, cold, bare, impersonal vent, rusted temperature reading 58 degrees. I looked away quickly, but more photos followed. The disassembled nebulizer, the cold vent, the inverted lock on the outside of the door, the missing medication bottles that I hadn't realized were gone. My chest tightened. They were locking me in," Linda nodded. "It appears so. And the smoke concentration was highest at the vent leading directly into your room. A professional inspector confirmed the duct was tampered with." My stomach dropped. Tampered. "Someone manipulated the airflow to redirect smoke," she said softly. "Not enough to kill you quickly, but enough to degrade your health over time." The room swayed for a moment. I gripped the rails of the bed to steady myself. "They wanted the stipend," I whispered. "They wanted me sick enough to justify it." Linda placed a hand on mine. "Anna, you survived a situation that many don't walk away from." A soft knock sounded on the door. Daniel stepped in, his expression grim but focused. He carried his own stack of paperwork. "I have updates," he said, sitting on the edge of the chair. "And consequences." I held my breath. He continued. "Based on APS's findings, the police filed a warrant to search the rest of the house. They found financial documents, drafts of emails, text messages, and something else." What I breathed. "A notebook," he said, "where Claire kept track of your habits. When you woke up, when you showered, when you used electricity, when you complained." She wrote that word a lot. My pulse fluttered. She kept notes. "On me, yes," Daniel said, "and on how much she believed she could claim in caregiver benefits once the stipend was approved." It felt like my ribs were crushing inward. Linda added gently, "She included estimates for projected decline." My breath caught. Projected decline. As if my sickness was a budget line. Neither of them spoke. They didn't have to. A wave of nausea rolled through me. I pressed a hand to my mouth. "They planned all of this," I whispered, "before I ever moved in." "Yes," Daniel said softly. "You weren't a burden to them, Anna. You were a revenue stream." I don't know how long I cried quietly, uncontrollably, grief pouring out of me like a slow hemorrhage. Not grief for myself, but for the sister I had once believed existed. That sister had died long before I arrived at her doorstep. When my breathing steadied, Daniel spoke again. There's more. I braced myself. Matt was caught yelling at an APS worker, threatening actually. The police were called back. They detained him overnight. A strange sensation washed over me, fear and relief blending into one trembling exhale. And Claire, I asked. She's cooperating now, Linda replied. But she's angry, very angry, mostly at you. I closed my eyes. That didn't surprise me either. She claims you betrayed her, that you chose outsiders over family. Daniel snorted. Family doesn't poison family, poison. The word hit too close to the truth. Linda leaned forward. There's another development. A neighbor submitted doorbell camera footage of the morning you collapsed. My breath stalled. What did it show? You stumbling outside before crawling back in, she said, struggling to breathe, looking terrified. That alone will support the case. And there's audio too, Daniel added. From when the paramedics arrived. Matt told them you were hysterical for attention. I lowered my head. Shame tried to rise, but I forced it down. Shame didn't belong to me anymore. Linda flipped to another page. APS's interim recommendation, and this is important, is that you be placed in a safe temporary residence until we complete the full investigation. You will not return to Claire and Matt under any circumstances. A tear slid down my cheek. Where will I go? Daniel smiled gently. We've arranged an emergency placement, a furnished apartment near downtown, quiet building, accessible bathroom, no stairs, medical equipment included. I blinked, stunned. For me, for you, he said. No cost, funded through a state program for vulnerable adults recovering from abuse. My hands trembled. When can I leave the hospital? As early as tomorrow, Linda said. Your new place will be ready by then. My heart picked up speed, not from fear this time, but something else. Something that felt like hope, raw and unfamiliar. Daniel hesitated before speaking again. Anna, there's something I need to ask. Did you ever notice paperwork missing, or anything else out of place? APS found evidence suggesting Claire accessed your personal files? My eyes widened. I had an envelope with my medical records, and some old insurance forms. They vanished weeks ago. I thought I misplaced them. Linda nodded firmly. She didn't want you to know the extent of your protections. Or your rights. The betrayal sank deeper. I whispered she wanted control. She doesn't have it anymore, Daniel said. The conversation paused when the nurse returned to check my vitals. When she left, Linda stood. I'll be back later with the final documentation, she said. Try to rest, Anna. You've endured more than enough. When she left, Daniel turned toward me again. You won, he said quietly. It doesn't feel like winning. He nodded. Justice rarely feels like triumph right away. Sometimes it feels like breathing after almost drowning. His words stayed with me long after he left. Later that afternoon, Linda returned with photos taken during the search. She laid them out on the table. The duct modification, the smoke residue in the pipes, the turned-around lock, the invoice notes, the scribbled budget Claire kept for my care. I looked at each one carefully, not because I wanted to, but because I needed to see the truth. Denial had blinded me long enough. By evening, my room was quiet. The sun dipped low, casting a warm glow across the blankets. A softness settled over my chest that wasn't just from the oxygen, it was something else, something like clarity. Just when I thought the day was ending, Linda returned one more time, breathless. Anna, she said, a development just came in. My pulse quickened. What is it? She drew in a deep breath. Claire and Matt requested a meeting with us. They want to negotiate. They're panicking. I stared at the wall for a long moment before finally saying, good. Linda blinked at the steel in my voice. I wasn't surprised. I heard it too. This time my voice didn't tremble. This time their fear didn't silence me. This time I wasn't the one suffocating. Tomorrow I would walk into my new apartment. Tomorrow I would breathe clean air. Tomorrow the people who tried to break me would learn that I wasn't done fighting. Not by a long shot. I walked into the APS conference room with my heart pounding, not from fear this time, but from something heavier anticipation, the kind that gathered in the hollow of the ribs right before a storm breaks. Daniel walked beside me holding a folder of documents that seemed far too thin compared to everything I had lived. Linda followed, tablet tucked under her arm, expression calm and unreadable. The room was bright sun spilling over the long table like a spotlight. At the far end sat Claire and Matt. Claire's eyes widened when she saw me. She looked smaller than I remembered, shoulders hunched, face pale, lips pressed into a thin line. Matt, on the other hand, leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, jaw tense. It was the same posture he used whenever he was about to assert dominance. But today wasn't his arena. Daniel pulled out a chair for me. I sat slowly, my oxygen concentrator humming beside me, a gentle reminder of everything they had tried to take away. Claire broke the silence first. "Anna, you look terrible." I raised an eyebrow. "I looked worse the last time you saw me." She flinched. Matt snorted. "We didn't come here for dramatics." Daniel set the folder on the table with a quiet, decisive thud. "Good. Because we're here for facts." Linda opened the meeting. "This is a formal case conference regarding allegations and evidence of vulnerable adult abuse, intentional endangerment, financial exploitation, and unsafe living conditions. Both parties will have the opportunity to speak, but APS will present first." Matt rolled his eyes. Claire clasped her hands tightly in her lap. Linda tapped her tablet. "Let's begin with the environmental findings." The screen on the wall lit up with the photo of my vent, rusted dark and heavy with residue. Claire gasped quietly. Matt stiffened. "This," Linda said, "is the air system leading directly into Anna's room. The duct was manually modified, causing airflow to concentrate smoke and cold air into her space at levels 4 times higher than the rest of the house." Claire whispered, "That's not possible." Daniel replied, "The technician who installed the system confirmed the adjustment was made after installation." Matt snapped, "Maybe the house is old." "No," Linda interrupted sharply. "It was tampered with, deliberately." Silence settled over us like dust. Daniel unfolded another photo. "This is the nebulizer Anna relied on. The water chamber was emptied multiple times, and the tubing disconnected." Claire's voice quivered. "She's clumsy. Clumsy doesn't explain fingerprints on the valve," Daniel said. Matt bristled. "You're stretching." "The data doesn't stretch," Linda replied coolly. "It reveals." Daniel continued sliding more photos forward, each one a confession they didn't voice. The bruise on my cheek, the locked pantry, the reversed lock on my bedroom door, the thermostat locked at 58 degrees, the invoices I'd been forced to pay, the notebook detailing my projected decline. Claire's face drained of color completely. "That was for budgeting." "Budgeting," Daniel echoed, "for how to profit from Anna's deteriorating health." Claire covered her mouth. Matt's jaw tightened visibly. Linda folded her hands. "We also have audio recordings." I watched their eyes widen, not with guilt, but panic. Daniel pressed a button. Matt's voice filled the room. "You're making everything harder for yourself." "Stay in your room. We see everything." His words hung in the air like smoke. Claire swallowed hard and looked at him as if hearing his tone from the outside shocked her. Then came Claire's own voice, sharp and unmistakable. "If she slips up again, don't help her. Let it play out." My stomach twisted. Claire looked down at the table, unable to meet my eyes. When the recording ended, silence fell again, heavy, suffocating, honest. Finally, Linda spoke. "Based on the evidence, APS recommends immediate no-contact orders, full removal of Anna from the home, mandatory restitution of all funds taken, and court-ordered behavioral rehabilitation." Claire's head snapped up. "No contact." "She's my sister," Daniel answered calmly. "You forfeited that role when you endangered her." Matt slammed a hand on the table. "This is insane. She's manipulating you. She's done this for attention." "Attention doesn't create duct tampering," Linda said evenly, "or sabotage medical equipment." His lips curled. "She's lying. She's always been unstable. I felt my body go cold, but for the first time I didn't shrink. Daniel placed a printed transcript of my 911 call on the table. You mean the same unstable woman who called for help while suffocating? The woman paramedics found with oxygen saturation levels dangerously low. The woman whose inhaler was under a dresser and whose nebulizer was dry. Matt's confidence faltered. I inhaled deeply steady, empowered by air that was finally mine. I almost died. And both of you watched. Claire burst into tears. I didn't want you dead, I just needed things to be easier. You were always coughing, always needing something. You wanted the stipend, I said quietly, not me. Her silence was the loudest truth she'd ever spoken. Matt leaned forward, voice sharp. We took you in, we fed you, we gave you a place to stay. And this is how you repay us. Daniel's tone was ice, with survival. Linda tapped her tablet again. Given the severity of the findings, the next step is determining restitution. Claire sniffled. Restitution, Linda recited numbers calmly. All collected funds returned. Compensation for medical negligence, penalties for unsafe living conditions, potential criminal charges pending review. Matt's face flushed with anger. You can't do this to us. Daniel smoothed the edge of his folder. You did this to yourselves. The tension in the room thickened until it felt like a wall. Then Linda said something I wasn't expecting. Anna, would you like to say anything before APS finalizes these recommendations? I wasn't ready. Not really. My throat tightened and my eyes stung. But something inside me insisted now or never. I leaned forward slightly, fingers trembling around the cup of warm air my hands formed on the table. When I came to your house, I began softly. I thought I was coming home. I thought I still had family. Claire began crying harder. But I realized I continued, voice gaining steadiness. Family doesn't lock vents. Family doesn't watch someone struggle to breathe. Family doesn't profit from illness. Matt scoffed. Claire shook her head, mouthing something like, I didn't mean to. I needed help, I whispered, and you gave me rules, cold air, and fear. My lungs tightened, but this time from emotion, not illness. I wasn't a burden. I was a human being. I still am. Claire covered her face. Matt looked away. Linda nodded gently. Thank you, Anna. Daniel closed the folder. We're done here. As we stood, Claire reached out feebly. Anna, please. I stepped back. For the first time, Claire stopped reaching. Matt glared at me, hatred flickering in his eyes. But behind that, just for a moment, something like fear. Fear of consequences, fear of exposure, fear of losing control, fear he had never imagined I would be capable of causing. We left the room. When the door closed behind us, it felt like a chapter of my life sealed itself shut. Walking down the hallway supported by Daniel on one side and Linda on the other, I felt tired, so tired, but lighter. Not healed, not yet, but lighter. As if a weight I'd been carrying in my lungs had finally loosened. Outside the building, cold air brushed my cheeks. Clean air, untainted, nothing like the stale smoke I had lived under for so long. Marjorie stood waiting by the curb, holding a small thermos of tea. Her eyes lit up when she saw me. You did it, she whispered. I didn't know if I had done anything other than survive, but I nodded. Daniel said this was the hardest part. He didn't mean the meeting. He meant facing them, facing the truth, facing the parts of myself that had believed for too long I didn't deserve better. My lungs inflated slowly, gratefully, as if learning how to breathe new air. Tomorrow APS would finalize the orders. Tomorrow Claire and Matt would face accountability. But today, for the first time, I wasn't afraid of them. Today, I began to reclaim my breath. The apartment APS arranged for me didn't look like much at first glance, a small one-bedroom on the second floor of an old brick building near the river. But the moment I stepped inside, oxygen filled my lungs with a kind of ease I hadn't known for months. The air smelled faintly of lavender cleaning spray and fresh paint. No smoke, no cold drafts, no vents humming with deliberate cruelty, and no one watching me. The social worker who drove me from the hospital, a quiet young woman named Jenna, helped me bring in my few belongings. She placed a small welcome basket on the table, tea tissues, a warm blanket folded neatly over the top. "If you need anything," she said gently, "I'm on call 24 hours. You just ring this number." I nodded, fingers brushing the card she handed me. It felt strange to be cared for by strangers, while the people I had trusted with my life had nearly taken it. When Jenna left, the silence was so complete that it felt like a new kind of sound, soft, sacred. I walked to the window and opened it wide. Cold winter air drifted in, crisp enough to sting but clean enough not to hurt. I breathed deeply, a full inhale, a full exhale. No pain. No stinging in my ribs, no coughing fit waiting behind my lungs. I leaned against the window frame, letting that simple miracle wash over me. Later that afternoon, Marjorie came by with a grocery bag full of fresh fruit soup bread and the same honey she'd brought me in the hospital. When I opened the door, she looked at me as if she were checking whether I was really real. "You have color in your cheeks again," she said softly. "I can hear your breathing from here, and it's different." "Different good or different concerning?" I asked. "Different alive," she said. I laughed, a sound that felt unfamiliar and awkward as it left my throat. She helped me put the groceries away, and for a while we just stood together in my little kitchen, not needing to say much. Before she left, she placed her hands on mine. "You're safe now. You know that, right?" I wanted to say, "Yes, I know." But safety is not something you learn overnight. It returns in whispers, not declarations. "I'm trying," I said instead. She squeezed my hands and left. That night I sat on the couch, my couch with a blanket around my shoulders and the oxygen concentrator humming softly beside me. I scrolled through my phone until I reached the photos I'd taken in Claire's house. I studied each one carefully, letting the grief settle but not consume me. The bruise on my face, the disconnected tubing, the icy vent, the notes Claire kept, evidence of survival at a cost I was only beginning to understand. A knock sounded at the door, my heart jumped, instinct kicking in before logic did. But when I peered through the peephole, Daniel stood on the other side holding a folder and a paper bag. I opened the door cautiously. "Delivery," he said with a small smile, holding up the bag. "Soup and bread from my wife. She said to tell you it's her mother's recipe and guaranteed to help anyone who's been through hell." Emotion swelled unexpectedly in my chest. "Please tell her thank you." "I will," he said, stepping inside. "I hope you don't mind me stopping by. I wanted to give you an update." I gestured toward the couch and he took a seat while I sat in the armchair with the blanket wrapped around me. "We have a settlement proposal," he began. My breath hitched. "Already," he nodded. "After yesterday's meeting, Claire and Matt's attorney reached out. They want to avoid a court trial." "What does that mean for me?" Daniel opened the folder. "It means you have leverage, and you're finally being compensated for what you endured." He listed the terms slowly, each one sinking into my ears with a mixture of relief and disbelief. Full restitution of the money they took, payment for medical bills, compensation for emotional and physical harm, mandatory behavioral courses, no contact orders for a minimum of 3 years, state monitoring for any future caregiving claims they file. And Daniel added, Claire agreed to sign an affidavit confirming the tampered vents and the sabotage to your medical equipment. I swallowed hard. She admitted it. Yes, he said gently. She didn't want criminal charges. I looked down at my hands, inhaling slowly. She really would have watched me die. Daniel didn't answer. He didn't need to. He closed the folder. But that's not your future. This, he gestured around my small apartment, is the beginning of the next part. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then I asked the question that had been pressing against my ribs like a bruise. Do you think I'll ever stop feeling afraid? Daniel leaned forward slightly. Fear is normal, Anna. You lived in a state of survival. Your body will need time to relearn safety. But you're not broken. You're healing. Healing. The word was too big, too hopeful, too soft for someone who had spent months coughing in the dark. But in Daniel's voice, it didn't sound impossible. Before he left, he set a business card on my coffee table. "You call me if you need anything," he said. "Not just legally, anything." His sincerity made my throat tighten. "Thank you." After he was gone, I warmed the soup in my little kitchen and ate it slowly, savoring each bite as if tasting something new for the first time. The next few days passed quietly. I slept, I breathed. I walked around my small living room without fear someone would take issue with the sound of my footsteps. I opened the windows and let the cold winter air in just because I could. But healing isn't linear. Some nights I woke up expecting to hear Claire's voice telling me to keep it down. Some mornings I checked the vents automatically. Some afternoons I caught myself listening for footsteps outside my door. But each time I reminded myself, they're not here. I am safe. One afternoon while making tea, I received a text from an unknown number. My breath stalled. "Anna, this is Claire. Please don't block me. I just need a minute." My fingers trembled as I read the words. Linda had warned me Claire might try to reach out even with the no-contact order pending. Curiosity gnawed at me. Her next message came, "I'm sorry. I know sorry isn't enough." But I didn't know how to stop once it began. My throat tightened. I stared at the screen for a long moment before locking the phone and placing it face down on the counter. I didn't delete the message, but I didn't reply either. That night, I dreamed about the vent in my room, a silent mouth exhaling smoke. But when I woke up in the morning, sunlight streamed across my blanket like a soft reassurance. I got up, made tea, and breathed deeply. Later that morning, Marjorie visited again. She brought me a small potted plant, the same kind she kept in her own living room. "It cleans the air," she said. "Thought you might like that." I smiled, touched. "Thank you." As she settled into my armchair, she looked around and said, "This place suits you. You look like you belong here." I exhaled slowly. I'm starting to believe that. She leaned forward. "You know, Anna, I think you're stronger than you've ever been." I didn't answer. I just let the words settle inside me like seeds. That evening I sat by the window again, watching the soft glow of city lights reflecting off the river. My lungs expanded rhythmically, no longer battling the air around me. For the first time in so long, breathing didn't feel like surviving. It felt like living. And tomorrow, Linda told me APS would finalize the no-contact order. Claire and Matt would be legally barred from coming near me. Tomorrow I would take another step toward rebuilding the pieces of myself they tried to break. Tomorrow I would begin writing the next chapter of a life they never expected me to reclaim. And tonight, I allowed myself one fragile truth. I made it out. And I wasn't done healing. The day the no-contact order became official, the air in my apartment felt lighter, as if the walls themselves exhaled with me. Linda arrived with a folder containing the final documents, her expression brighter than I'd ever seen it. She placed the sealed packet into my hands with a soft but triumphant smile. "It's done," she said. "They cannot contact you, visit you, or approach you in any capacity. If they try, the police will intervene immediately." I held the papers carefully, almost reverently. They felt heavier than their weight, like armor, like truth, like the justice my lungs had been gasping toward for months. "Thank you," I whispered. "You did the hard part," Linda replied. "You survived." She hugged me gently before leaving, and when the door closed behind her, I leaned my forehead against it. For a moment, I simply breathed. Not out of necessity, not out of fear, but out of relief. Later that afternoon, the doorbell rang again. I looked through the peephole and saw Daniel standing there with a white envelope in hand and a tired smile creasing his face. I opened the door quickly. "Got a minute?" he asked. "For you always," I said. He stepped inside and held out the envelope. The settlement funds were processed today. I wanted to deliver this part personally. I hesitated before taking it. I don't know how to feel about taking their money. "You're not taking," he said firmly. "You're reclaiming. And this isn't charity, it's accountability. It's restoration." I ran my fingers along the envelope before opening it. Inside was a check larger than anything I had ever held in my hands. Enough to cover my medical bills, enough to give me stability, enough to prove that what happened to me mattered. I sank onto the couch, the weight of it grounding me. Daniel sat across from me. "How are you settling in?" I glanced around the apartment, small but warm, safe, in a way no mansion could ever be. It feels like breathing clean air after months in a smoke-filled room. He smiled. "That's exactly what it is." We spoke for a while about next steps, ongoing medical support therapy options, community groups for vulnerable adult survivors. I listened, nodding, feeling a strange mixture of exhaustion and strength rise through me. Before he left, Daniel paused at the door. "Anna, I need you to hear something." I lifted my eyes to his. "You didn't just survive them. You exposed them. You stopped them from doing this to someone else. You changed the story." Emotion hit me so suddenly that I had to grip the doorframe. "Thank you," I murmured. He nodded and stepped into the hallway. "Take care of yourself, Anna. You earned this new beginning." After he left, I closed the door and stood in the quiet apartment listening to the hum of the heater, the soft ticking of the kitchen clock, the gentle rhythm of my own breath. All sounds of a life that belonged to me again. I made tea and sat near the window, the cup warming my hands as I looked out at the winter sky. Snowflakes drifted down slowly, soft, delicate, peaceful. Nothing like the cold that had curled under the door of my room in Claire's house. This cold didn't hurt. It was gentle. It made the world softer. In the days that followed, I built small routines, morning stretches, light walks to the river, afternoon tea evenings, with books I'd once been too exhausted to focus on. Whenever I felt my chest tighten, I rested. Whenever the apartment felt too quiet, I opened the window and listened to the city breathing. Marjorie visited often, bringing plants, soup, gossip, and comfort. She sat with me in my living room one evening as we watched the snow fall through the window. "You're glowing," she said. "Glowing me?" I laughed. She nodded. "It's what happens when the fear leaves your body." I touched my chest gently. "Sometimes it still whispers." "It will," she said. "But it can't control you anymore." Her words settled inside me, warm and steady. One morning as I was watering the small plant she'd given me, a letter slid under my door. I recognized the handwriting instantly. Claire's. My heart thudded. The no-contact order meant she wasn't allowed to reach out, but she had. I picked up the envelope and stared at it for a long time before carrying it to the kitchen table. I sat down, the check from the settlement still resting nearby like a reminder of everything that had been revealed. With trembling hands, I opened the letter. "Anna, I know I'm not allowed to contact you, but I needed to say this. I lost everything. Matt is blaming me for what happened. He says it was my idea, but it wasn't. Not entirely. I didn't realize how far things had gone. I didn't realize you were that sick. I didn't realize you were suffering so much. I'm sorry. I don't expect forgiveness. I just hope someday you'll understand I never meant to hurt you. Claire." I read it twice. Not meant to hurt me. But she did. Not realized I was that sick. But she watched me struggle for breath daily. Not her idea. But she kept the notes, the calculations, the applications. The words didn't sting as much as I expected. They didn't soothe either. They simply existed like the last remnants of smoke after a long, damaging fire. I folded the letter and placed it inside a drawer. "I don't need this," I whispered. Because forgiveness wasn't the goal. Healing was. And healing didn't require going back to the person who held the match. That afternoon, I took a longer walk down to the river. The snow had stopped, leaving a soft blanket over the ground. I moved slowly but steadily, breathing deeply through my nose, feeling each inhale expand my chest without resistance. When I reached the riverbank, I sat on a bench and watched the water drift under the bridge. For the first time in a long time, I didn't feel like a burden, or a problem to be solved, or a pawn in someone else's desperate plan. I felt like a person again, a whole person, a person with a future. I pulled out my phone and turned on the microphone. Old habit. But instead of documenting pain, I documented peace. January 23rd, I said softly. Breathing feels easy today. The air is cold, but it doesn't hurt. I walked to the river and didn't cough once. I think I'm starting to recognize myself again. My voice trembled at the end, but with hope, not fear. As the sun began to set, painting the sky with soft orange and violet, I whispered something I never thought I'd say again. I'm free. And for once, the echo in my chest didn't sound hollow. It sounded alive. If you've ever clawed your way out of a place that tried to break you, if you've ever had to rebuild your breath one moment at a time, know this: your story isn't over. Your healing matters. Your voice matters. And your courage, quiet as it may be, is powerful beyond measure. If my journey resonated with you, I hope you'll share your thoughts below. Tell me what part stayed with you, or how you found your own way back to yourself. And if you want to hear more stories of survival, justice, and unexpected comebacks, stay with me. Hit like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss what comes next. You're not alone, and your breath is yours to reclaim.